Hi, everyone. I'm Gloria Goins, and I'm the principal for Health Equity at Amazon Pharmacy. And I want to welcome you to my session, Why Unconscious Bias is Bad for Business. So there's some key assumptions upon which my session is predicated. Number one, I'm making the assumption that all of you want to meet and exceed your existing business objectives. And then I also make the assumption that none of you come to work to do anything that is intentionally harmful to your coworkers, your customers, your business goals, or your brand. I'm also assuming that everyone is committed to creating environments that will optimize performance, innovation, and profitability. Now, here's the most important thing. If over the next hour or so, if I could show you some evidence-based research that would enable you to drive greater business results and growth, then you'd want to know about it. But more importantly, once I share that data and that evidence with you, you're willing to try just one new thing to accelerate your business goals and objectives. So here's our roadmap for today. One, I'm going to unpack what is the business case for inclusion, diversity, and equity. And so to make sure we're all on the same mental constructs of what I mean by those terms, think of inclusion as environments that are trusting, valuing, and informed, where all of your teammates and associates show up in their full authentic selves. Think of diversity as all of the gifts and the stories and the journeys and the superpowers that you bring to your teams and organizations that have to be understood and valued. Think of equity as not just equality, but think of equity as creating fairness, recognizing that we all don't start from the same place. So I'm going to unpack what is the value proposition for that. I'm going to give you some actual case studies where equity, diversity, and inclusion has actually been utilized to drive business results. And then we're going to pivot and explore what gets in the way of creating those environments that drive inclusive cultures, products, and services for our customers and our employees. And then I'm going to explain why unconscious bias is really bad for business. And more importantly, I'm going to talk about what we can do about it. And then I'm going to give you an opportunity to reflect on how to apply your key learnings the moment you leave this session. So let's talk about what is the value proposition for ID&E. So back in 2012, I actually wrote an article entitled, "Is the Business Case for Diversity a Myth or Just Understood?" And the key takeaway of that article was simply this, that whether or not an organization or a team or a leader experiences the value proposition, the business outcomes that come from inclusion, diversity, and equity are really inextricably tied to whether or not they've got someone who's a subject matter expert, who understands that organization's business goals and objectives, but more importantly, someone who can marry the two. And so the key takeaway of that article says that when properly understood and applied, diversity actually drives more business outcomes. So the evidence also says that if you want an organization that's really intelligent, what really makes organizations intelligent is the diversity that exists amongst its team. And so people who are different from one another across a wide myriad of diversity spectrums, whether it's gender or race or ethnicity, bring unique information and experiences that help organizations drive better outcomes. Think about this for a second. If you want innovation, innovation is by definition different. So to get that innovation, you've got to curate diverse perspectives and opinions. And so what the evidence also says is that when diverse teams work together, productivity and innovation actually improve over time. There's a caveat to that, because what the research says is that that productivity and that innovation that occurs is not a straight line. What happens is when diverse teams get together, there's something that's called creative abrasion, where there's this back and forth, this norming and the storming that occurs before you start to see that lift. But when the teams settle, when they thrive and are embedded in inclusion, they outperform more homogeneous teams. And so one of the things that McKinsey found is that there's actually a correlation to how diverse an organization is and its actual financial outcomes. So one of the key things that McKinsey found was that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity were 25% more likely to outperform their industry competitors when you looked at things like EBITDA, right? Their growth was much more substantial than those peers and competitors at the bottom quartile for gender diversity. A similar finding was found for companies who had executive teams that were racially and ethnically diverse. Specifically, the finding was that ethnic diversity, the top quartile of those companies, were 36% more likely to outperform their industry peers. Now, typically when we look at these studies, the question always becomes, okay, Gloria, is that causation or is that correlation? And the answer is it's correlation, and there's a caveat. The caveat is diversity only gives you those business outcomes when it's supported by inclusion. So let's talk about why precisely inclusion matters. So Harvard did a study that talked about the fact that inclusion is not just a nice thing to have. What Harvard found was that teams with inclusive leaders actually have better business results. So specifically what Harvard found is that 17% of the teams with inclusive leaders were more likely to report that they were high-performing teams. 20% were more likely to say that they're making high-quality decisions on behalf of their customers. And 29% were more likely to report that they were working collaboratively as a team. 83% they were more likely to agree that sharing diverse ideas helped them and empowered them to develop innovative solutions. And what's interesting is Harvard also found that if you could just increase the perception of the environment and the leader being inclusive, you could actually see as much as a 10% increase in productivity and engagement. Harvard found that there were 6 traits that really distinguished inclusive leaders from leaders who were not considered to be inclusive. Here they are. First, an inclusive leader has a visible commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. You know where that leader stands. And he or she not only talks the talk, he or she walks the talk. They're humble. They recognize that as a leader, they are a steward and a servant. They're aware that they have biases, mainly unconscious, but they work to make sure that their biases don't impact how they show up. They learn and they're curious, not only about themselves, but about others. So they have curiosity about others. They have something called cultural intelligence, which means that as leaders, they understand that there's no such thing as a view from nowhere, that we all see the world through our own lens and through our own frames, and that other people's culture is not a failed attempt at being us, that those cultural nuances and those cultural differences, when understood and valued and levered, actually enhances business outcome. And last, they understand the power of effective collaboration in its ability to reach the best outcomes for customers. And so, how does an inclusive leader show up? So here's what Harvard found. They shared their personal weaknesses. It goes back to that concept of being humble. So here's some quotes from the several thousands of people that Harvard actually surveyed and interviewed to say, how does an inclusive leader show up in your organization or on your team? So here's a quote. This leader will openly ask about information that that he or she's not aware of. She demonstrates a humble, unpretentious work manner. This puts others at ease, enabling them to speak out and voice their opinions, which she values. An inclusive leader learns about cultural differences. This leader has taken the time to learn the ropes, common words, idioms, customs, likes, dislikes, and the cultural pillars. An inclusive leader acknowledges team members as individuals. Here's an example. This leader leads a team of over 100 people and yet addresses every team member by name, knows the work stream they support and the work that they do. Why is it important to have inclusive leadership when we're looking for growth, when we're looking for innovation, when we're looking for business outcomes? It's because every organization's biggest challenge, particularly today, is how to generate more growth. In order to have growth, you have to be able to differentiate. To differentiate, you need to innovate. To innovate, you need diversity. To activate, to empower, to leverage diversity, you must have inclusion. How do you do that? You have to have leaders who are inclusive. So what I want to do now is walk you through some actual examples of how, when you marry these concepts of inclusion, diversity, and equity, how they have actually proven to drive greater business results in terms of sales, marketing, brand equity, and most importantly, customer obsession. Here's the first one. So I'm really privileged that one of my mentors is a gentleman by the name of Kevin Clayton, who currently is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the Cleveland Cavaliers. But back in his former life, Kevin was the very first Chief Diversity Officer for Russell Athletics, which when he joined was more than a 100-year-old organization. And when Kevin first joined the organization, he was in a meeting with the leadership team and he asked them, hey guys, why is it that with all the uniforms and balls we sell, we don't sell to historically Black colleges and universities? And in fact, when we drive to work, every day we come to our headquarters, we literally pass 4 historically Black colleges and universities on our way to work. Why is it that we haven't reached out to any of them to sell our products and services? And the answer was, we don't know. We never thought about it, right? So here was an opportunity literally hiding in plain sight for this organization. And so Kevin said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to visit all of these universities and I'm going to let them know what we as an organization have to offer. And what Kevin did is he brokered the very first contract for Russell Athletics with historically Black universities for an entire conference. It was called the Southwestern Atlantic Conference, and it consisted of 10 schools. And what was so powerful about this deal was not only because it was the very first time that Russell had ever done business with historically Black colleges and universities. Here's the catch. The quality of the uniforms were better and they were cheaper. And Kevin's deal resulted in 1 year a $50 million incremental sale to the bottom line of Russell Athletics, simply because he was able to bring that lens and that awareness and bring an opportunity that was hiding in plain sight to drive greater sales, marketing, and brand equity. Here's another one. This one's mine. So before coming to Amazon, I was an executive at Prudential. And I recall it being the year 2013, and I'm sitting in a meeting with our chief marketing officer and his team. And there was this huge debate about whether or not Prudential should market to women. And the question was, well, should we market to women? Are our sales force mainly men? Are they going to be are they going to be comfortable? And literally, I sat in this meeting, ladies and gentlemen. I thought I was being punked, literally, because I'm saying to myself, Women make 80% of all financial decisions. How could we not market to them? And so what I did in that meeting is I shared some data around what I knew about women, about the power of the purse, how we made the most financial decisions, and how by not marketing to women, we were literally leaving half of the financial market on the table. And so I launched an initiative called The Power of the Purse that ended up doubling the life insurance sales of Prudential in 1 year. And I also encourage Prudential to become a thought leader. So every other year, Prudential publishes a study on the financial habits and behaviors of women. And in one of its most recent studies, it showed that no matter what your status is, whether you're single or you're married or you have a domestic partner, 53% of all women today are the primary breadwinners. And that as of 2020, women hold and control $72 trillion in private wealth. And they're more willing to seek out the advice of a financial advisor than men. So to not reach out to this market and this opportunity that was hiding in plain sight, Prudential was literally leaving half of their customers on the table. Here's another example. I had the privilege of being hired as the very first Chief Diversity Officer at the Home Depot, and I was specifically hired to build the Hispanic business strategy for the company. Had the opportunity, by the way, to bring some of those insights to Amazon and incorporate them into our Hispanic business strategy here at Amazon. But at the time that I was at the Home Depot sold the most paint of any retailer in the world. And to give you some context for this, think about this. Think about the Brooklyn Bridge or any bridge you can think of, right? Home Depot sold enough paint to paint any large bridge that you can think of 100 times over. But here was the kicker. As much paint as the Home Depot sold, we sold paint colors like Colonial Blue and Williamsburg Green. And so when I talked to my Hispanic customers in focus groups, they would say, Goya, we love shopping at Home Depot. We buy a lot of paint, but we want colors that reflect our culture, like miel and café, honey and coffee, and tierra and chocolate, earth and chocolate. And so based on that customer feedback, I worked with our marketing and our merchandising team and one of our vendors called Bear, and we created the first line of paint that was geared towards the Hispanic community, and it was called Colores Orígenes, which stands for original colors. And not only did this line of paint become attractive to our Hispanic customers and become popular among our Hispanic customers, it actually became the #1 selling paint brand in the Home Depot. The crossover to the general market was unprecedented and unforeseen. And even some 2 decades later, after that initial launch of paint was instituted at the Home Depot, not only is it still sold, not only is it still a top seller, there are other companies that take those same colors and have rebranded them to match their company. So Royal Caribbean, for example, takes those same colors and gives them, names like, blue of the ocean and maritime green. And it also inspired yet another line of paint called Heritage Colors, geared towards our African American customers and their affinity for historically Black colleges and universities. So these are 3 examples of how just having someone with a diverse perspective can bring an idea to an organization that can monetize it to the level that it creates unprecedented growth and sales for an organization for opportunities that otherwise would have just been hiding in plain sight. So I now want to pivot to what gets in the way of having an inclusive culture. So, Gloria, if there are business objectives and innovation and disruption that comes from having an inclusive culture, what gets in the way? So, here's what I want to do. I want us to pause and look at this picture. And you can do this mentally, or if you're taking notes, you can jot down some thoughts or ideas. When you see this picture, what comes to mind? What do you see? Jot down the thoughts and the images that come to mind, knowing that there is no right or wrong answer. So just take a second or two and just write down what you see in this picture. Now, here's my question. Now, what do you see? You see, ladies and gentlemen, when we don't have the complete picture, our mind very quickly starts pulling from files and filling in the picture. And sometimes in our team meetings, sometimes in our work back sessions for customers, our files are just wrong or they're incomplete. You see, there's this old saying that says, hey, I'll believe it when I see it. I've got an 18-year-old and I tell her, hey, Grace, I'm from Missouri. I'm from the Show Me State. I'll believe it when I see it that you're going to change your behavior and so I won't have to take your iPhone, right? So we all have heard that old colloquialism, right? I'll believe it when I see it. But here's what the evidence actually says. You see, the evidence doesn't say that I'll believe it when I see it. The evidence actually says we see what we believe. We see what we believe. And when we don't see what we believe, our mind quickly goes into something called cognitive dissonance, right? And we quickly start explaining away why it is that what we're seeing doesn't align with our beliefs, right? We explain it, we deny it, we ignore it, we rationalize it away. You see, this is how fast we think. A millisecond is 1/1000th of a second. Yet it only takes 100 milliseconds to see someone for the very first time, notice that person's race or ethnicity, and make a determination whether or not that person is trustworthy. Make a determination whether or not to cross the street. Make a determination as to whether or not that person poses a threat to you. Yet it takes 300 to 400 milliseconds for the human eye to blink. So literally, before my eye does this, before I blink, I have seen someone for the first time and made an assumption about their character, about their ability to be an Amazonian, about their worth, simply at the blink of an eye. And that's because we tend to see people only from the surface. And much like this iceberg, what our coworkers, what our customers, what our vendors are about, most of that is below the surface. Most of it you can't see. And so that's why we've got to have environments that are inclusive and equitable so that we can get to what's below the iceberg, because what is below the iceberg many times influences how we show up, how we delight our customers, how we get to innovation. So most of you are seeing me for the very first time. You've never heard me speak. You've never seen me around Amazon. And so when I began talking and when I talked about what I was going to cover in this session, and I say this with all humility, your mind very quickly started forming impressions about what I was about, what this session was about. And some of those files were just incomplete or just wrong. So here's what I mean by that. So here's what you can't see by just looking at me from the surface. So number one, I very unwisely studied 4 languages at the same time in college. And some 3 decades later, I still think I have PTSD from hearing my Italian teacher cuss me out in Italian because I kept speaking Spanish in her class. Those two languages were just too close. So I studied English, Spanish, French, and Italian all at the same time. I am a proud mother, grandmother, and great grandmother, meaning that my grandchildren have children. I was born and raised in Miami, Florida, that frozen winter rotunda, and I learned how to ice skate very professionally. And wherever I am, I typically look to find if there's an ice skating rink so that I can get on the rink. One of my sort of Clark Kent identities is for those of you who are old enough to remember, there was a time when, as humans, we did not have to dial 10 digits to make a local phone call. If you were in your local area code, you just dialed 7 digits, right? So one of my sort of Clark Kent identities is that when I was an attorney for the phone company, implemented a technology called an overlay, which was the very first time in the history of the country that technology was implemented. And I implemented it to benefit customers so that they wouldn't have to change their numbers when the phone company ran out of numbers in a particular area code. But it required us to make a one-way door decision, which required everyone to dial 10 digits to make a local call. So we don't think about that today. It's very transparent to us, but there was a point in time when we did not do that. And my decision I made some years ago are the reason that we all do that. The last thing that you can't see is that when I was in a 200-year-old healthcare organization, just prior to joining Amazon, when I was the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, I was actually the executive coach for the CEO. And I coached him on everything from equity, diversity, and inclusion, and cross-cultural competency. And typically when I share what you can't see about me from the surface, I always ask people to raise their hand or just tell me, is there anything on this list that is a surprise to them? Now, I will tell you in transparency, I never ask them which one. Because I never want to leave any session under the impression that anyone looks at me and thinks that I'm old enough to be a grandmother, much less a great grandmother. And so I typically try to explain why that is. I'm married to someone who is a little bit older than I am, and I have stepchildren who are in their 40s, who have children in their 20s, who in turn have babies. In fact, I have 5 great granddaughters, and I can tell you that never gets old. So what gets in the way of these inclusive cultures and teams and leaders that actually get us to the next level of innovation, the next level of growth and sales and customer outcomes? It's something called unconscious bias. And so there are many ways to define it. This is how I define it. Unconscious, also known as implicit bias, occurs when an individual's subconscious beliefs about attributes, the things you can typically see above that iceberg, like race, ethnicity, gender, social economic status, age, sexual orientation. And here's the kicker. Those things you can see result in an automatic and an unconscious reaction or behavior, even in the well-intended person. They don't even know it's happening. And so one of the things I want to calibrate is that having unconscious bias is not inherently a bad thing. And everyone watching my session today has unconscious bias. How do I know that? Because we're all human. And unconscious bias is innately and inherently human. It's part of our biological makeup. It's part of our neuroscience. You see, what scientists say is that in any 60-second period of time, there's about 11 million pieces of information that travels across our brain. But our brains can only efficiently process somewhere between 40 to 50 pieces of information, and we only use about 7. So we're trained and wired as human beings to take mental shortcuts. It's how we survive as a species. It's that mechanism in our amygdala, in the part of our brain, that's that fight or flight mechanism that allows us to survive. So this is a picture from my backyard that I took a couple of weeks ago. This is a 7-foot iguana. I live in Parkland, Florida, which is called the iguana capital of the world. And so this is how my unconscious bias kicked in, right? So all the rational things of they're scared of humans, they're going to run away. When you see a threat to you, as I saw a threat to me, I didn't do a Venn diagram. I didn't do a SWOT analysis. I didn't pull up the data on how iguanas are not harmful to humans. I saw this and ran. And this is the picture that my husband took after he laughed, right? So what am I saying? If you saw a carnivorous animal charging towards you, that fight or flight mechanism is going to kick in and you are likely going to run. You're not going to be rational about what you need to do in that first instance. And that's because what we know about unconscious bias is that it happens without our knowledge, awareness, or control. And it often is in conflict with our conscious attitudes or beliefs. Here's what I mean. You can be a strong advocate for our veterans, but still have unconscious bias against veterans. You can be a strong advocate for women and still have unconscious bias against women. We tend to hold unconscious biases that favor our in-group, however we define our in-group to be. And what we also know from research is that unconscious biases are malleable. They can be changed. We used to believe that bias was this aberrant thing that couldn't change. We now know through extensive, intentional exercises, awareness over time, we can actually sort of rewire our brains and at least say to ourselves, we shouldn't lean into the first thought because we have no control over it, but we should lean into the second thought after we've had a time to really respond rather than react. And what we know because of how our brains are just wired, even when we think we're making rational decisions, the evidence says that 99.99996% of all of our decisions are unconscious. So pause for a second. When we're in a team meeting, when we're in a leadership meeting, when we're in a work back meeting designed to innovate for our customers, we have to keep in mind that we're bringing unconscious biases to that conversations. And so we have to engage in mechanisms and processes that interrupt them. So what I want to do now is show you how prevalent unconscious bias shows up, particularly in the workforce. So there's some research out there that says that when you go to a job interview, that the drink temperature influences how favorable you'll be seen by an interviewer. In particular, the evidence says that if the interviewer has a warm cup of coffee or a warm cup of tea, he or she is more likely to view you favorably than if they have a cold drink. I always try to go to my interviews in the morning because I'm playing this research in the back of my head. So it wouldn't surprise anyone that there's a lot of unconscious bias against people who are considered large-bodied, right? There's a lot of body shaming, image bias in our society that we're all really cognizant of. So it wouldn't surprise you to know that people who are considered large bodies tend to be viewed less favorably than people who are considered to be small or average bodies, right? But what the evidence says is something a little bit more nuanced. What the evidence says is not only is the large body candidate perceived to be less favorable, if you as someone who's considered to be a small or an average body candidate is sitting near someone who's considered large bodied, that anti-large body bias transfers to you because of proximity bias. Last example I'll give you is there's this notion that accents People with accents are less factual, less intelligent, right? Obviously, whether or not you have an accent is from your point of view, but there is this unconscious bias about people who have accents, with one exception. So take one beat and think about, what accent do you think there would be an exception around being perceived as being intelligent or not? It's actually British. So here are more examples of how unconscious bias shows up in the workplace and how we as leaders must put in mechanisms that arrest and address them. So Yale's done a lot of studies around unconscious bias and just naming. So there was a study where they took one resume, the exact same resume, and the only thing that was different about the resume is that it had names that were either sort of typical or what we consider to be white sounding names as opposed to African American sounding names. So one set of resumes had names like Greg and Emily, and another set of resumes had names like Keisha and Jamal. But the substance of the resumes were exactly the same. And what Yale found is that the resumes with the more Anglo or white sounding names were more likely to be called in for an interview than the exact same resume with the more African American sounding names. Yale also found that both women and men scientists believe that men should be hired more readily. Because they're more competent, and more importantly, they should be paid more. So let's unpack that. In STEM, there is evidence to say that both men and women think that men are better qualified to have STEM roles. They're more capable, and they should be paid more than women. The last one is this. Even though less than 15% of all men in America are over 6 feet tall, 60% of all corporate CEOs are 6 feet tall and over. We have an unconscious bias towards people who are tall. So here's what I want to do. I want to engage you in an exercise. I want you to look at these two tables, Table A and Table B. Here's my question for you. Which table is bigger? So just take a second and sort of mentally lock in your answer or jot it on a piece of paper if you're taking notes. So the question is, which table is bigger? Let's explore that. Actually, the tables are exactly the same. The parallelogram that you see in that image are the same. So the question becomes, okay, Gloria, so what does this have to do with unconscious bias? Here's the key takeaway. When we're not used to seeing the exact same person or the exact same information in the context that we're used to, our unconscious bias sometimes prevents us from seeing the exact same thing. If someone who's a principal engineer or someone who's a software development engineer doesn't come in the package that we expect a principal engineer or a software development engineer to look like, we may miss that person as an Amazonian. If the idea doesn't come from the person on the team that we expect that innovative idea to come from, we may miss it, or we may only see it or recognize it when the exact same idea is presented by someone else in the same meeting who brings it up from a package in which we expect it. So what happens when people aren't included? There's a lot of evidence that says that what employees are trying to do, because they're not naturally in inclusive environments, is they're bending themselves out of shape to fit in. In fact, 61% of all employees across all spectrums of diversity say they're bending themselves to fit in to the culture in which they find themselves. In fact, 83% of LGBTQ employees say they're bending themselves out of shape. 79% of Black or African Americans are. 66% of women say they are. 63% of Hispanic, Latinos say they are. And 45% of straight white men are saying they too are bending themselves out of shape to fit into the culture. And so what happens when employees do that? Not only is it just bad for business, it's bad for innovation, it's bad for our ability to delight our customers. People actually psychologically and physically suffer. So what we know from the research is that when people bend themselves out of shape, they have a psychological pain of feeling excluded. And for those of you who have children and have ever experienced them coming home to you to recount a story of how they were bullied or how they were excluded or how they were mistreated, you know the pain they felt. It's the same psychological pain that children feel when they're bullied, when employees bend themselves out of shape. And that psychological pain ultimately becomes a physiological pain that results in everything from headaches, anxiety, stomach aches, that results in absenteeism, that results in people walking out of our organization, that results in people staying in place but not being engaged. People are literally suffering because they're not included. And so what can organizations do to make sure that the cultures are inclusive? Well, number one, everyone, no matter where you sit, whether you're an IC or you're a manager of managers, everyone across the organization or company can work hard to, one, appreciate people for who they are, especially if they're different from you. We can all do our part to make sure we're making fair and equitable decisions about all people and eliminating these notions of favoritism, right? We can build intentional connections between and among people who might see themselves as completely different. And most importantly, we can all work to build something called psychological safety. So let's talk about why psychological safety is important for business, it's important for inclusive environments, it's important for innovation and growth. So Harvard and Google did a lot of work and study on psychological safety. And first, just to get grounded on just the construct of what I mean by psychological safety, think of it as the feeling that people have where they feel comfortable and authentic, where they can suggest ideas, where they can admit mistakes, and they can take risks without being embarrassed or retaliated against or marginalized. And so what Harvard and Google found that if you zoom out, psychological safety is the most dynamic and important thing that sets successful teams apart from ones that are not successful. And the more psychologically safe people feel, the more willing and the more unafraid they are to take the kind of calculated risks that Amazonians are encouraged to take that can spark new innovations and disruptions and delight our customers. So here's an exercise we can do to kind of gauge our own personal psychological safety in where we sit today. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to imagine that there's an opportunity to do something new within your team, but that new opportunity requires a certain amount of risk. And so I want you to think about this risk metaphorically as jumping from one mountain to another. And what you see are four images that represents various distances between mountains, right? And the further apart the mountains are, is how much risk you would have to take in order to give birth to this idea. So here's my question. How much risk would you take? It's a new idea. You're on a team. How comfortable are you taking the risk? Is it option 1, option 2, option 3, option 4, which is simply saying, hey, I wouldn't take the risk at all because I don't feel comfortable that if I fail, I'll be given the benefit of the doubt and I'll be allowed to re-experiment. Now, here's what I want you to do. What do you think would happen if you took the risk and it didn't work out? One, would people say, hey, Gloria, that's great. It's the fire phone, right? It didn't work out. Come up with something else. Fail fast. That idea didn't work, but let's come up with other ideas that we can use to delight our customers and drive innovation and growth. Number 2, do you think you would be hurt or humiliated by the team? Number 3, do you think that you would suffer some type of loss, up to and including actually being eliminated from the team? So jot that down, because this is just a really quick, unscientific way to help you assess how psychologically safe you currently feel. And I'm proud to say that when I headed up diversity, equity, inclusion for the North American Consumer Division of Amazon, I worked with our connections team to add in new questions that specifically double-clicked into how psychologically safe our team members felt. So we basically took our inclusion index and we said, let's add some additional questions that we're going to ask across North American consumer that Amazon writ large may want to add. And the questions were things like, I feel comfortable being my authentic self on my team. I feel comfortable being my authentic self at Amazon. Again, recognizing the importance of psychological safety in team and business outcomes. So, how does a leader create a psychologically safe team? Well, one, the leader's got to show the team that he or she's engaged, right? Because the team is taking clues from you as the leader. You are the standard bearer for your organization. Let your team understand all of the things that they're balancing and challenging. Tight deadlines, shifting priorities, limiting resources. Avoid blaming the team and others. Take ownership. Be self-aware. Check your biases and demand that your team does the same. Make sure your team is actually included and involved in your decision making. When you make a decision, make sure your team's fingerprints are on it. People are less likely to support things they haven't built. Always be open to feedback. Be vocally self-critical and champion your team, to your managers, and to other teams. So let's talk about some of the lessons learned when I was the head of diversity, equity, inclusion from North American Consumer. And to do that, I want to start by showing you what experts say is the most difficult optical illusion to solve, right? Because what I want us to focus on is, are we seeing what's really there? So here's my question for you. When you first look at this, do you see an old man with Ivy Leagues around him, or do you see a couple kissing? What do you see? And I've shown this optical illusions multiple times, and sometimes it takes people as long as 30 minutes to uncipher it. And so here's what we learned that worked really well in North American Consumer. Number one, we learned to take a systems approach to our work. Meaning, if you and I are at a party and we're on a dance floor, we're seeing things only from our left or our right or our periphery. But if we take a systems approach, we're actually able to look at things from the balcony and see what some of the root causes are. And so one of the decisions we made was that our ID&E goals should be treated and resourced like every other business goal. And so our goals were supported by our VPs. They were owned by our VPs. They were partnered with me and their HR leaders, but our VPs signed up to support all of our ID&E goals, just like our business goals. We listened. We had listening circles for women, people of color, to make sure that their experiences were heard and seen, and made sure that they had the opportunity to show up authentically and that we weren't missing anything. We made sure that we were measuring inclusion, diversity, engagement, and equity in every possible mechanism and process. And in order for things to be successful, we knew that we had to dedicate ID&E resources. Just like we would staff or fund any other important goal, we did that for our ID&E goals. Then we incorporated ID&E into every talent customer mechanism in which we could find. And last but not least, we offered multiple opportunities to learn and to be curious, just like this session today. So what's the first step? How do we unpack unconscious bias? How do we get to that innovation? The first step is self-awareness. Eleanor Roosevelt said that you first have to understand what motivates you to do or to feel things. Because until you do that, you will never really be able to understand what happens to other people. So the first step is to thy own self be true and recognize that all of us have unconscious biases that have to be checked. Cross-cultural competency. That's the must-have skill that experts say unpacks and mitigates unconscious bias that gets in the way of innovation. In fact, experts say that it's one of the top 10 skills needed in every single industry from now and to forever. And typically when I say culture, we often think of racial or ethnic culture, but really culture just defines any set of behaviors, attitudes, or mores that defines a social group. So what does that mean? The culture at AWS is not the same as the culture at Amazon Pharmacy. The greatest opportunity we have for cross-cultural competency is the recognition that there are 5 different generations at work today. How do you build that? How do you build cross-cultural competency? It's a 3-step process. First, it's about self-awareness, right? It's about recognizing that there is no such thing as a view from nowhere, that we all show up to every situation with a particular lens and a particular viewpoint. Second, it's about making sure you understand that other people have different life experiences, that we live in parallel universes, and other people's life experiences and perspectives aren't wrong because they're not the same as ours. They're just different. Cross-cultural competency is that ability to not only recognize and appreciate the difference in culture and experience, in lifestyle, in story and journey, but also the ability to appreciate and to bridge across those differences. So what we know from research is that we don't learn from experience. We learn when we have an opportunity to reflect on those experiences. So here's what I want you to do. This is the time for you to reflect on the data and the evidence that I've been sharing with you over the last several minutes. And so here's what I want you to do. I want you to check your blind spots. There's a really great book that I recommend for you called Blind Spot: Hidden Biases of Good People. And it was written by the authors and the creators of something called the Implicit Association Test. And what that is, it's a free tool that was developed at Harvard that allows you to take and check your unconscious biases across a wide spectrum of different things. Everything from gender to race to skin color to weight to sexual orientation. And it's now a well-accepted tool to check your blind spots, but it has nothing to do with your unconscious biases, your conscious biases. So I would encourage you to, if you haven't taken that test online, to take it, to do it as a team, and even share your results across your respective tests. Here's what I want you to do. Remember at the start of the session, I said I wanted you to walk out of here with just one thing. So what I want you to do is If you haven't been jotting down some key insights, go ahead and jot down what some of the key insights you've had throughout the session are, and write down the ones that you're going to dive deeper into, that you're going to do some additional exploration on. And then I want you to decide, what is that one new thing that I challenged you to do that's different? What is one new thing you're going to do that's going to allow you to show up more inclusively tomorrow, just having attended this session? Then, what's that one new thing that you would recommend that your team or your organization does to ensure that it or they are more inclusive, diverse, and equitable? So jot those things down, and I'm going to challenge you not to just leave these notes here, but to really bring them forward the moment, the second, the instance you have an opportunity to share your learnings with your teams. Oliver Wendell Holmes once said that every now and then a man's mind is stretched by a new idea or a new sensation, and that it never shrinks back to its former dimensions. I hope that in the time that I've had with you today, that I've been able to stretch your minds just a little bit, and I've empowered you to be more inclusive, more innovative, and I've empowered you to get better business results on behalf of your teams and your organizations. Thank you so much for joining me today, and enjoy the rest of your day.